Hey, what's going on there, guys? Nick here from Absolute MTG, and today we're going to be taking a look at a deck tech for Jund Midrange for the Theros season of Standard. And if you guys remember the previous seasons of Standard, ever since Return to Ravnica came out, Jund Midrange has been a pretty big thing. It's been one of the most popularly played decks, and for good reason. It had really good tournament results. It was a pretty consistent deck, and it played a lot of really good creatures and spells that just made it really good. However, after the rotation, we lost things like Olivia Voldaren, Thragtusk, we also lost Huntmaster of the Fells and Bonfire, so there were a lot of things that ultimately we just can't use anymore. However, with the release of Theros, we do have a few new cards that we're able to play in this deck, and we're also able to play a few cards that have already been in existence and in Standard. It's just they've been overshadowed by other cards that were pretty much just better at the time whenever Jund Midrange was being played. So the entire deck list is down below where you guys can check it out and use it as a reference. There's also a deck list on TappedOut.net, which is in the description below, where you guys can check that out. If you're not familiar with anything that I'm talking about in this video in terms of the cards in the deck, you can scroll over the name of each card on TappedOut.net with your cursor, and it'll pop up a little image, and you can familiarize yourself with the card and what it does. So let's get started here. So first off, the most important thing with like mid-range is the creatures that you choose to have in here. So the creatures that I chose to have, starting off with our mana dork, is Sylvan Caryatid up here at the top. So I have a playset of Sylvan Caryatid. It's not as good as Farseek was, just because Farseek permanently puts a land out onto the table, but a 0/3 mana dork for 2 mana that has the hexproof is pretty good for us. It is going to tap for any color of mana based on what we ultimately are going to need. It lets us play our 4-drops and 5-drops a lot sooner, and it lets us get planeswalkers like Xenagos and Chandra Pyromaster out onto the battlefield a lot sooner than our opponent would like us to have them, ultimately giving us a pretty nice advantage. So he's the only mana dork in our deck. We have a playset of Exava up there at the top. So Exava was a card that was just really good whenever she was released. However, cards like Falkenrath Aristocrat, Olivia Voldaren, and Hellrider and Aggro were just pretty much better at the time, so she really didn't see any play. But ultimately, with her Unleash, First Strike, and Haste, she is a 4/4 creature for 4. And each other creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has haste as well, which isn't as relevant for us, really. But with Exava, having a 4/4 for 4 with haste and first strike that we can play on turn 4 or on turn 3 if we played Sylvan Caryatid is awesome. It's kind of almost like we have Luxodon Smiter in our deck. It's like the Luxodon Smiter for Jund, except it's more costly, but the trade-off is that it has haste and first strike, so it's still definitely really good for this type of a deck, being able to play it early on. We have 3 Desecration Demon up at the top, so Desecration Demon 6/6 for 4 flying, and at the beginning of each combat, an opponent can sacrifice a creature. If a player does that, then we tap Desecration Demon and put a +1/+1 counter on him, and I ended up going and putting this deck together. Whenever I was doing it, I had 6 slots open for creatures, and rather than doing a like 4-2 split with anything, I ended up doing a 3-3 split between Liliana's Reaver and Desecration Demon. The reason being that Desecration Demon is really awesome when your opponent doesn't have any creatures or anything. However, there is a huge downside to it, where if your opponent has a better board state than you and you're just top decking things to try to overcome what your opponent's doing, if you top deck and play Desecration Demon, your opponent can still get around it and be able to win, like if they're playing aggro or something like that. So he's a little bit worse whenever it comes to creature-based aggro if we don't have like enough removal to deal with what our opponent's doing, especially if they're swinging alpha. But Desecration Demon definitely is really nice whenever the situation is in our favor, like when our opponent doesn't have anything that they can sack, or they can't sack toward their advantage of being able to still swing around Desecration Demon or anything like that. Still really amazing creature, 6/6 for 4 flying, definitely perfect for us. I did mention the 3 Liliana's Reaver, 4/3 for 4 Death Touch. Death Touch on a 4/3 creature for 4 is really awesome. It can block a lot of different things and be able to deal with them, especially if we're forced to 1-for-1 and just trade the Liliana's Reaver into something else. But whenever he successfully deals combat damage to a player, that player discards a card and we get to put a 2/2 black zombie creature token onto the battlefield tapped, which is nice. So it's going to put pressure on our opponent, and a lot of times it's going to put the situation where they're either going to have to trade a creature if we're swinging in, or they're going to have to trade to discard a creature or discard a card from their hand, and we get another creature onto our battlefield. So there is a nice trade-off that we have with Liliana's Reaver on putting pressure on our opponent from different angles, but ultimately it's a great 4-drop creature for this deck. We have a playset of Reaper of the Wilds, so 4/5 for 4, and whenever another creature dies, we get to scry 1 for 1 black against Death Touch, and for 1 generic and 1 green against Hexproof until the end of the turn. Reaper is great up against control because a lot of times it's going to force our opponent to use a Wrath to be able to permanently deal with it, because a lot of spot removal that they may have is going to be not as good whenever we have the mana open to be able to use the Hexproof. Like, if we're able to use Xenagos to ramp, and instead of like using our lands to tap out to play Reaper of the Wilds, we are still able to keep 2 lands open, and we can play the Reaper of the Wilds, have the 2 mana open. So things that they may have, like Detention Sphere, just aren't really as good, and even if we're swinging in and our opponent has like a Azorius Charm or something like that, it's just not as good whenever we have the mana open, so that's definitely a plus side to it. Also, whenever Reaper of the Wilds and like other creatures are dying, the Scry 1 is definitely really nice. Even if our opponent is going to go and Wrath our board and we have Reaper and like a Sylvan Caryatid, and those are the only creatures on our board and both of those die, being able to Scry 1 is just kind of like a bonus. It just kind of cushions things to the point where we at least get to see what our next draw is going to be, and adjust things. If it's like another land drop and we're sitting at 5 lands, we really don't need another land drop. So it's definitely good for that. But the fact that it can gain Death Touch, it also has that amount of pressure that like Liliana's Reaver can have, but being able to gain Hexproof is amazing. We have the playset of Stormbreath Dragon, one of the best, if not the best card out of Theros in terms of just really good rares, really good mythics. Stormbreath Dragon is probably my favorite card from Theros, 4/4 for 5. It's kind of like Thundermaw Hellkite, only it's been dumbed down in terms of power and toughness, but at the same time it has benefits to it as well with the Pro White. So 4/4 for 5 flying, haste Pro White. It has Monstrous for 7, and the Monstrous is 3 whenever we make it Monstrous, which doesn't happen often. But the nice thing about this deck is we can ramp into Monstrous off of Xenagos if we have like enough creatures on the battlefield where that +1 is relevant. But he's going to deal damage to our opponent equal to their hand size, which is definitely a plus side on top of making it somewhat bigger, making it a 7/7 instead of a 4/4. But Pro White sometimes is relevant, sometimes it's not. It gets around like a Azorius Charm, so that's definitely good. It gets around Detention Sphere as well if our opponent just wants to do 1-for-1 removal. So that's definitely a nice way to be able to utilize Stormbreath Dragon in certain matchups where the white is somewhat relevant. For our Planeswalkers, I have the 3 Xenagos and I have 1 Chandra Pyromaster. The reason why I chose to go with more Xenagos over Chandra Pyromaster is being able to leave mana open with Xenagos, where even if the amount of mana that we're adding is like 2, and we're able to leave 2 mana open, that allows us to leave things like Golgari Charm open, which is nice up against control, being able to combat any Supreme Verdicts that they're able to play. It also allows us to keep mana open for Reaper of the Wilds, which I mentioned, and it lets our Rakdos' return have a bigger X value. It makes our opponents syncopate if they're playing it a lot less valuable for them, because we have a lot more mana that we can ultimately tap into. It lets us ramp into Stormbreath Dragon for the Monstrous, which is nice. It gives us a bigger X value for Mistcutter Hydra. So there was a few different things that I noticed with that ramp ability for Xenagos, which made me want to play him over like another slot for Chandra and have it like a 2-and-2 split. Also, being able to make 2/2 haste creatures is awesome up against control. It is going to make far and away a little bit more awkward for our opponent when we're making a lot of 2/2s, and ultimately, just like post-Wrath, being able to have 2/2s that have haste that swing in is always nice. But I do have the 1 Chandra Pyromaster, and Chandra Pyromaster is awesome. She is going to be able to exile cards, or exile a card off the top of our library with her 0 ability, where we are able to cast it during the turn whenever we exile it. We, of course, have to still pay the mana cost and everything like that, but it's going to ultimately allow us like to dig a little bit more with getting to find answers if we're in top deck mode. The +1 is going to deal 1 damage to up to 1 target creature an opponent controls and to one of our opponents or to our opponent. And that creature isn't going to be able to block if we dealt damage to it, which is nice. It can definitely skew the way the board state is going. But it's the biggest thing with Chandra Pyromaster is she allows you to have like more cards per turn that you're able to tap into with that ability to exile off the top of your library and play things from the top as opposed to what's only in your hand, which is definitely perfect, especially if you're using Scry to your advantage, like Reaper of the Wilds and the Scry land. If you're able to utilize that Scry and then play off with Chandra Pyromaster, it's definitely good synergy that you can tap into. But Chandra Pyromaster is, of course, a great mid-range type Planeswalker for this deck. For our removal and other spells that we have 2 Abrupt Decay, which deals with things like Ashiok, Detention Sphere, any creatures that are 1-3 converted mana cost, Advent of the Worm tokens, any other tokens of that variety. So it's good for all that. Luxodon Smiter as well. We have 2 Doomblade for all non-black creatures that it could potentially hit any of the like Naya creatures that they may have. Luxodon Smiters, the Advent token again. There are a lot of good targets that Doomblade can hit. 1 Putrefy, no bias against what creature we're hitting with it, and it can also destroy an artifact, which could be relevant for any of the god weapons if our opponent's playing them, like being able to get rid of Whip of Erebos or Spear of Heliod if it comes down to like white or white-green aggro, which could change the way that the board state or combat math that our opponent has. If they swing in having calculated a certain combat math, we go and use Putrefy to get rid of it. It can make a difference. We have 2 Heroes Downfall, destroying target creature or planeswalker at an instant speed. Definitely great. Dreadbore, there's always kind of like that unequal balance with Dreadbore or Heroes Downfall. I just went with Heroes Downfall because it's instant speed. Double black isn't too much of a big deal. I kind of made the mana base for the deck so it could support black a little bit more heavily with the way I distributed the basic lands, so double black shouldn't be a problem. 2 Mizzium Mortars. Another thing that I forgot to mention about Xenagos, it can help us ramp into an overloaded Mizzium Mortars as well, so that's definitely great. It lets us play Mizzium Mortars a lot sooner with that overload, which is good for the creature-heavy decks. Deals 4 damage to target creature you don't control. Overload for 6 deals damage to each creature you don't control. And it deals 4 damage. The 1 Rakdos is return 1 in the sideboard for the control and mid-range matchups, letting them have less things that they can ultimately use against us. The land base, each one of the shock lands, so we have a playset of Stomping Ground, playset of Overgrown Tomb, playset of Blood Crypt. We have a playset of Temple of Abandon for the Scry land in our deck. We have 4 Swamp, 2 Mountain, 2 Forest. For our sideboard here, we have 1 Scavenging Ooze, 2 Golgari Charm, 1 Hero's Downfall. We have 1 Rakdos' Return, 2 Pharika's Cure, 1 Mizzium Mortars, 3 Mistcutter Hydra, and 4 Thoughtseize. So the way that I kind of package things in is that for the basic control decks, probably more so for blue-white than Esper. Esper is a little bit more tricky, but then again, they are a lot more greedy with their mana base, so sometimes they can get screwed on mana, or they can be set back by Scrylands and stuff like that. But for the control matchup, I like to side in the 3 Mistcutter Hydras, the 4 Thoughtseize, 2 Golgari Charm, and 1 Rakdos' Return. And the Thoughtseize and Rakdos' Return are just hand manipulation. We are going to be able to see what our opponent has with Thoughtseize, take something that is of value to them. We can also write down things that they have, and then we can just kind of have a better idea of what our opponent's playing in the up-and-coming turns, and we can just kind of plan for things a little bit better. But being able to take something of high value from them is definitely good in both early, mid, and late game as well, depending on what we have and what we're trying to work with. The Rakdos' Return is awesome for just being able to have it as a finisher, and whenever our opponent is tapped out, we can cast it, and usually we can get rid of their entire hand, if not the majority of their hand, which is good, so it's definitely a huge setback. Then we have the 2 Golgari Charm for being able to regenerate our creatures. It also deals with Detention Sphere as well, so that's definitely good. And the Mistcutter Hydra, just because it has Pro Blue, it gets around Detention Sphere, it's going to get around Zoria's Charm as well, and just pretty much like any blue blue stuff that our opponent may have. But like the two big things that I've encountered so far have been Detention Sphere and Azorius Charm that our opponent can't get rid of. But we can just commit a huge amount of mana into it. It can't be countered. It has Pro Blue, and it has haste as well, so it can as well be another great card where we play a creature. Our opponent may like wrath the board next turn, and then we can play Mistcutter Hydra, and we can just swing in on that turn and not really worry about a whole lot. So Mistcutter Hydra is great for any like blue decks, blue control, anything like that. But it's also good up against the mono blue decks that are seeing a lot of play now because of the Pro Tour, and I'm expecting to see a lot of them in my meta, and especially when I go bouncing around events, I expect to see a lot of those. So Mistcutter Hydra is definitely a great way to be able to get around those mono blue decks because of the Pro Blue. For the aggro matchups, I have the 1 Mizzium Mortars, 2 Pharika Secure, and Scavenging Ooze that I like to side in. The Scavenging Ooze is just another way to gain back life after killing a bunch of our opponent's creatures. It also gets bigger, so it's a threat on its own. Pharika Secure is just an easy way to kill X2s and gain back 2 life. So that's pretty much the biggest purpose for that. And up against a lot of those aggro decks, a lot of their creatures are going to be like 1, 2 toughness, sometimes 3 toughness, so it'll just get rid of any of those 1 or 2 toughness creatures that we need to get rid of. And Mizzium Mortars, because it's easy to overload, gets rid of their entire board, and ultimately is just easier to cast than like Hero's Downfall, so we have it. It's much better than like Hero's Downfall up against aggro, because doing 1-for-1 trades against aggro really isn't adequate whenever you're casting, or you're spending 3 mana to get rid of a creature that your opponent only spent 1 mana to cast. Sometimes it's just what you have to do to get rid of like the only creature your opponent has, but whenever they have a board of things that they're spewing out, paying 3 mana to get rid of 1 creature really just isn't good enough. So Mizzium Mortars is definitely a fine way to be able to pay 2 mana, get rid of something, or pay 6 mana, get rid of potentially everything. Then the Hero's Downfall. The Hero's Downfall is more for like the mid-range matchups, like creature-based mid-range, like Junk, also some Jund variants. I haven't seen too many of them, but they're bound to pop up. Naya mid-range, like creature-based mid-range, or even just like a mixture of creatures and spells and planeswalkers, whatnot. Hero's Downfall is much better for like mid-range than it is for just straight creature, spew, hyper aggro, whatever you want to call it. So there's that, but that pretty much sums up the sideboard. Scavenging Ooze just as a one-of, like I mentioned, just for being able to recycle the creatures our opponent has in their grave and turn them into a little bit of life that we can gain back, and also making the Scavenging Ooze bigger. But yeah, that pretty much concludes our Jund mid-range deck tech. So the entire deck list is down below if you guys missed out on anything. You can use it as a reference, and be sure to check out the list on TappedOut.net so you can familiarize yourself with all the cards. If you enjoyed this deck tech, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more Magic the Gathering content. And until next time, guys, peace out.